Hi guys, Adam from Middle's Panel Builders again, and we're doing some more calibrations on 915 Mike Whiskey. The next calibrations that we're going to be doing are the trim and flaps in this video. So the procedure is very easy. Again, you're going to want to reference your maintenance manual for things like flap positioning and all that stuff. This is going to be in the context of the TSI, but the basic gist is going to apply to any airframe. So let's go ahead and get started with the trim first, because that's the easier one, and then we'll move on in a little bit to flaps. Alright, so in the aircraft here, we're in configuration mode on the G3X. So like I said, we're going to do the trim position first. So one thing of note, when we set up these systems, we set up trim runway protections on them. And one of those protections is you can only hold the trim hat for a certain period of time before the trim motor will stop, and then you have to let go and do it again. So that's a protection for if the button gets stuck, that it doesn't keep moving on you. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down to engine and airframe. And then we're going to find our trim position, which is here, GP1 elevator trim. And you can see we got the red X telling us to calibrate. So we'll hit the calibrate button over here. And on the left side, you can calibrate full down, full up, or neutral. We'll do full up first. You can see that we've got an input voltage here. What we want to make sure of is that when we move the trim motor with the hat switch, that the input voltage moves. You can see though that it stopped even though I've still got my finger on the trim hat. That's that trim runway protection operating. So we're just going to keep going until the trim motor stops. Of course, we're assuming that the actual rigging of the trim tab to the motor has already been done correctly. So this is a Ray Allen servo. It's a 0 to 5 volt sensor, and you can see that we're at 0.002. So we're at the full up position of trim. So I'm going to store that calibration point. Now we're going to go trim neutral, which should be at basically 2.5 volts on the Ray Allen trim servos, but again, make sure that it's actually aligned on your aircraft per the maintenance manual. Okay, so my spotter's telling me that that's trim neutral, so I'll store it. And then we're going to go trim full down, and then we'll just take this all the way to the very end of the range, which again should put us somewhere in the neighborhood of about 5 volts of the input for this particular servo. Okay, that's it. So we'll store it. Make sure you hit save. Make sure you hit save again. And then we'll come back to there. We see elevator is -100. And if I move the trim motor, I just want to make sure that there's no jumpiness, no dropouts. And it's all good. And you can see that it goes blue as I'm commanding it too. So everything looks good here. So we're going to go ahead and close this out. You can put markings on here too, by the way. So what might be a good idea is to put like a tick mark at 0, which is neutral. And that just kind of gives you a slot. So that's actually says takeoff, which is pretty handy. So I'll save that on there. That's elevator trim. Now let's get into the flaps. Alright, so now let's talk about flap calibration. On the G3X system, there's 2 methods of doing flap control, and that is going to be what's called absolute or relative positioning. If you have toggle switches either on your grips or on the panel, you are doing relative flap positioning. If you have a rotary switch or you have push buttons, then you're doing absolute positioning. The only difference from the calibration standpoint is that with the absolute position system, your buttons to move your flap motor manually are going to be right here on the screen. But in this case, because we're in relative mode, we're just going to use the switches on the stick or the panel to move the flap motor to where we need it to be. A couple other things actually I'll have you look at really quick as you're doing this is in the flap section of configuration mode, obviously make sure the flap mode is correct. That's in relative position. And you see we currently have this option here for full flap max airspeed of 85 knots. When you get your positions programmed in, you're actually going to have another one for partial flaps. Don't forget to put that in, and we'll do that before the end of the video as well. Because otherwise, if you don't, your flap system is going to work unexpectedly. So, just like trim, we're going to go engine and airframe. We're going to find our flap position input. Again, we got a red X telling us to calibrate, so we will. So the first thing we're going to do is flap position 0. On the TSI, that's basically move the motor till it stops in the up position. Again, we're assuming that you've got these physically rigged correctly. However, you don't want it to actually be at the point that the motor stops. You want to bump it down just a little bit so that there's a little bit of movement on the input voltage. So what you don't want to have happen is you don't want the motor to stop while the G3X is still trying to command it, and then get into a situation where the G3X thinks that it has just a little bit more to go when it really doesn't, because things are going to change a little bit once there's air load on the actual flaps. So I'm going to hold the switch all the way to that position, which it already was. So I'll make sure we're there, and then I'm just going to give it a very quick bump down just to keep it in the right spot, and then we're going to store that point. So that's 0. Now, again, maintenance manual is going to tell you all the positions you want. On the TSI, we have 10, 20, and 33 degrees. So what I have is an observer that's over at the wing right now. I'm going to go to 10 degrees first, and they're going to tell me when we're there. Then we're going to go to 20, and then we're going to go to 33. They have an angle gauge over there that's telling us the positions. So we'll go flat position 10 on the screen, and then I'm going to move the motor until they tell me to stop. Our observer's telling me that that's 10 degrees, so I hit the store calibration point. Now we're going to go to 20. That's 20 degrees, store the calibration point, and then finally 33, which is basically going to be the end, and then you bump it up a little bit, but we'll just verify that with the gauge. Okay, so our flaps are in position for 33, so we'll hit store calibration point. You can see that the curve is mostly linear here. It's just a little bit less than linear because of the 3 degrees extra on the last position. What you don't want to have happen is like a huge plateau and then a drop, because that could indicate a sensor issue. So we're happy with that. We'll hit save. We'll hit save one more time. Now remember, I told you there's going to be an intermediate position maximum airspeed. So we're going to come back up to flaps, and you can see we got a partial flap max airspeed. In this case, I'm going to set that to 90 knots. Now we're good to go. So again, we're going to save and reboot, and then we're going to verify the operation of the flap system, and then that'll be it for this one. Okay, we're back to pilot mode here. So you can see that our flap indicator is still all the way in the down position. One thing you should do too that I neglected to is put little tick marks in for your different positions of flaps like I did on trim. I'll go back and do that after we're done here. So what you want to do now is, particularly in the relative position mode, you want to make sure that as you're pushing up on the switch to the different positions, that it commands the position and that it actually goes there. So you can see the little ghost caret as you command the different positions, and then the filled in caret chases it. So we did all the way up. Now we're going to go down and just make sure that you get to the commanded positions without any issues, and make sure that because you see that it turns cyan on the flap card when it's moving. You want to make sure that it goes to white at each position. So I like to run it through a couple times just to make sure this one works good. So we've got a working flap system now that's calibrated. Alright, so that is the flap and trim position calibration on the G3X touch system. One thing I'll mention, some people are going to be doing this with the VPX. That's not the context that we're working in here. We're working in the context of an aircraft equipped with the GAD-27. A couple other points I want to hammer on really quick. First is the flap partial airspeed and all that stuff. So we briefly talked about it in here, but when you're in relative positioning mode, there are maximum deployment airspeeds that you can program in so that if you're above those airspeeds, the flaps won't move. So on the TSI, we set the first position to be 90 knots to give you a little bit of buffer, and then the second and third position, so everything after that, is 85 knots. That's going to be different for your aircraft, but that's how we set it on the TSI. So that way, if we're above 85 or 90 knots, depending on what positions we're commanding, the flaps won't move and you won't overspeed them. The other thing I wanted to touch on is the fact that the TSI doesn't have it, but a lot of aircraft will use limit switches. So they're actual micro switches that go into the flap track and they get hit by the flap motor as they're moving. If you have a system like that, you don't have to do what I did, where you move the motor to its extreme limit and then bump it away from it a little bit, because the limit switch is going to take care of that for you. It helps the system further know exactly where it is in the travel of the flap system. Thanks for watching this video on flaps and trim calibration. I hope you found it useful. The next one that we're going to do is fuel tank calibration, so stay tuned for that, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.